an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Well, here we go. Look at that. Thursday, June the 29th. Dave Trafford here. It's Now and Next for Story Studio Network. Welcome in. And it is Feed Drop Thursday. We're going to continue highlighting our series. The first series we launched in Story Studio Network. The Next Normal. And it was a roundtable gathering of really smart people. Well, I might not have been the smart people around there, but I was included in the group. I would not include myself among the big brains there. Just there to ask the questions. We launched the show in 2021, a year into the pandemic, and the big questions that were looming. How could we build back better from the pandemic? It wasn't all doom and gloom. Oh, sure, it was devastating. And we're still feeling the effects. Our kids will continue to feel the effects of the pandemic long after the virus is in the rearview mirror. Not quite yet, right? We had a couple of bouts of the COVID in this house in the last few weeks. But it's taken on a different complexion in our lives. But we're still feeling the effects of it. Here in Toronto, we just had our mayoral campaign. A lot of it was about the state of the city, where we are, where we're at, the services we provide, the quality of the services we provide, and then, of course, the costs. And a lot of that is rooted in what we went through for COVID. So the Next Normal endeavored to dig in on some of those issues and asks the question, how will we cope in what is now the COVID era of the 21st century? In this episode, we talk about the new skills we discovered and that become necessary because of COVID-19.
Hello, I'm Erin Trafford.
Hi there, I'm Dave Trafford.
And we're into episode 7 of The Next Normal now. And really the conversation that we are having at this point is about post-pandemic skills development. What have we learned through the last year to 18 months about what it actually means to develop skills as it pertains to resiliency, as it pertains to this new economy that we're entering?
Well, it's also interesting to see how our perceptions of, or our meaning, and glad we have Ujwal at the table for this, our meaning of skills has changed because, Ujwal Arkulgud is our cultural anthropologist. He's been looking at, sort of meaning in a big, broad way. Obviously, or sometimes we think of, where the things he's talking about are deep, deep down. You know what? They're right in front of us. Mm-hmm. And we tend to trip over them because they're obvious to us. So I'd be curious to get his take on those things. But again, we've got Dave Hardy, our urban planner. Sarah Thorne is here. Her expertise is in behavioral research and risk and how people are going to manage that. So we've got all of these perspectives at the table. But of course, the one that we do want is Lisa Taylor, who is at Challenge Factory, and her expertise has been in future of work. And I think this is going to be probably the conversations that might be the most challenging for employees and employers to have moving forward. So, just because it will be one of those things, I didn't think of that.
Yeah, this conversation I found it to be one of the most provocative we have had so far, simply because I think it really busts some of the myths that we were living with about what it means to have skills, what it means to develop skills, who should be developing skills, and how.
And it's not just about technology.
No, it is not. So let's get into it.
Lisa, I think one of the things that perhaps surprised a lot of people is how quickly they learned new skills in the moment because you had to figure out the Zoom, or you had to figure out to be your own IT tech, something as basic as that. And as frustrating as that might have been, I would view that as probably a pretty good opportunity for individuals and employers, generally speaking.
It was really interesting to see who people thought, where people thought the struggle was going to be, who was going to struggle the most with that rapid shift to being at home and having to figure out technology and new ways of doing things, and who actually struggled. So as we made this rapid shift and all of a sudden people had to learn Zoom and different technologies and Slack and all kinds of ways to communicate remotely with each other, the assumption at the beginning was that older workers were going to be the ones that are going to struggle the most, because the trope, the fallacy is that older workers are slower with technology, that they're not as tech savvy, never mind the fact that all of the technologies that we're talking about were actually created by code written by older workers in their earlier parts of their career. So this assumption that there's demographic groups that are going to struggle because of a lack of skill, and then the reality of who actually struggled, to see that it was actually younger workers and people who had less experience within the organizations they were in, not because they lack technical skills, but because it's not the hard skills, if the way that we end up talking about skills, hard skills and soft skills. It's not the hard skills of how do I use a technology that really makes a difference. It's how do I communicate? How do I relate? How do I have empathy for my colleagues? How do I know what's happening with them in a way that's more on emotional connection? Those kinds of things for younger employees that had less experience in the workforce made the shift to home much more difficult for that demographic group than for the group that people were originally worried about. I think that this is a really good analogy for how we think about the entire skills divide. So often, there are discussions about how we need to focus on skills. It's become the panacea. You can see it in government funding and government programs and initiatives across industry sectors. We need to focus on skills, 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 skills. But the assumptions we make on what skills do we need to be developing and who's actually quite okay and needs a little bit of guidance, needs a little bit of assistance to be able to take care of their own agency and their own career, and who actually needs skill development is completely out of whack and usually the opposite of the way that programs are designed. I find that fascinating, that the very people that we think need the most help with skills are actually usually pretty resilient at learning new skills. What they need is opportunities, good jobs. They need the demand side of the equation, the employment cycle, to open up to them. They don't need to work on their personal skills. That they can take care of. So I think it's a really interesting point to open the conversation and to kind of take a look and say, you know, skills was high on the agenda topic before COVID. It was amplified during COVID. But this divide between who needs what and what assumptions do we make about skills is so core to the discussion. I'd be interested to hear what my colleagues have to say about that.
Well, let me ask you, Sarah, just based on that, because every one of us, I think, in our lives has had a teacher somewhere in our sphere. And you want to talk about skills. They're all skilled educators. But what we learned is that they weren't skilled educators in this environment, in this remote virtual environment. And so you got to, you know, how do we marry those two things? Or do we, again, expand what Lisa's talking about in terms of viewing that the skills you've got are only amplified or stunted by your inability or ability to use, you know, the Google chat room to deal with the kids? The curriculum's not set up that way. Our educational approach is not set up that way. We're talking about some fundamental changes, and that's just in education.
I think that's really true. And I think that when you look at the way that we've talked about skills and the focus on skills, and Lisa mentioned it, it's always been very top down. You know, these are the skills that we've determined that you need to have, and these are the training programs that you need to take. And I think what we've seen in the last 15 months is that people have really come to terms with their own skills, their abilities, what they like to do, what they don't like to do, and where they want to spend their time. And I think that if we were much more reflective and engaged people in the workforce in terms of what have they learned over the past 15 months about themselves and how they relate to other people? And what do they need to be successful? I think we'd be a lot further ahead.
I love that you brought that back to choice. And are we in control of what's driving us to need to use new skills? So the conversion with the teachers was not so much that it was impossible for them to learn the skills they needed to deliver remote. But as you mentioned, Sarah, there were structural elements in the way that curriculum is designed and delivered. There were structural elements in the technology that students had in their home and the environments that people were working in. It was, it got put on the shoulders of teachers of not having the skills that they were needed, but that actually wasn't what was taking place. And I think if we take a look at when do we have choices about how we shift and move from one occupation to another, or from one mode of working to another, or to choose to learn new skills, I think that has an enormous component of the success. One of our incredible research interns wrote a piece for us over the last couple of months, Sage Duquette. He wrote a piece that looked at what happened in the Newfoundland fisheries when it was determined, when the fisheries collapsed, that everyone would get trained to become technologists. So that's where there was a disappearing employment segment, and it was determined that everyone should shift from this kind of job to that kind of job, and here are the skills that you needed to learn. And it was a dismal failure, because nobody likes to be told every aspect of how their future is going to roll out. Everybody wants to be able to have some kind of choice and flexibility. Teachers found themselves with no choice and had to adapt very quickly. But at a broader policy level, we make decisions like this all the time. Drivers that are going to be displaced when autonomous vehicles come out, where should they shift? Let's make the decision of what the pool of jobs are going to be that we can shift them to. That's not the right way to look at how the future of work will unfold. It is very top-down and heavy, and it doesn't actually take into account every individual is going to have unique circumstances and needs, and we need a wide variety of places that people can go to. And people have the ability to learn all kinds of skills, not just the ones that we think is the most straight line to get them back into employment.
Dave Hardy, it's interesting that Lisa brings that up around, the sort of the dying fisheries. And last year it did a podcast, and it featured a guy whose family, longtime Newfoundlanders, and they lived on the water. They fished, and that's how they made their livelihood. And this guy and his brother were told by their uncles and their parents, you're going to have to find something else to do because the fisheries are dying. But he didn't give up the boat. He turned his fishing boat into a tour boat, and he takes people out to see the birds and all the whales and all that kind of thing. So here's a situation where he just took what skills he had. I mean, he's not pulling fish out of the water, but he's on the water and teaching people how to do this. It was really kind of interesting. He's taken basically the same skills and applied it to a completely different venture.
Yeah, that kind of resonates with me since half of my family is from Newfoundland and Labrador. So if you had them on the show would go on for hours about their opinions about the federal government and the fisheries. I'm as a planner, I'm looking at skills from kind of an urban community basis. What we're seeing in cities, and I guess there's a skills gap, as you're all saying, but skilled jobs just can't be filled. So the unions and many of the others and corporate employers, they just can't get workers. And I've seen some really good examples of helping people get into the workforce. A lot of work I've been doing is in communities where there's poverty. These may be new Canadians, people who do not understand English, and how to get them into the workforce and get them skilled up. And it's not easy. You start by, do you have a computer? No, our family doesn't have a computer. So it's some basic things like that. These are people that are not white collar. They will not likely be, at least in a generation, into white collar jobs. Eventually their whole family will be, they'll do very well. But it's tough to get those folks in cities, in those poverty areas, into the workforce. There's some good examples, and certainly all infrastructure investment, at least in Canadian cities, has a rider with it that you must create skilled jobs or you must train and teach. And you must reach down to those people who are in poverty and get them into the workforce. So that, to me, that's a very positive thing going on.
Ujwal, do we have a problem here, though, generally speaking, with a perception of what the skilled trades, for example, are doing? I've talked to folks in construction and those who mentor, do apprenticeship programs, and there's all kinds of opportunity, and they're good jobs, and they're being taught at community colleges across the country. But it's mom and dad who are telling the kids, you know what, it's better that you go to a university and take this kind of program as opposed to this skilled trade program in what we would have called in the day a vocational school. It's their perception that's holding them back for actually taking advantage of the opportunity.
I think one of the interesting things we've seen through the pandemic is the symbolic capital around learning online or learning without physically being at school or without being in a so-called, and I say so-called, reputed university. All of that, the symbolic capital around that has improved in the sense that there was a fair bit of stigma around, and this obviously affects people who are in poorer communities more than it affects others. But there's always been a stigma around learning online, around distance learning, around going to certain types of schools for learning. In the United States in particular, there's the added challenge that, and I think we have a similar problem in Canada if you take immigration out of the equation, is we have an aging population, and at least in the United States, people aren't retiring, or they don't have the savings to retire. So they need to figure out how they're going to keep their skills active and keep working much, much later into their lives, into their careers. And new skill development is critical, but it's always come with this stigma because, generally, if you're older, you're less likely to go to a traditional university, traditional school like the younger person might. And one of the good things coming out of the pandemic has been that actually two things. First, it's become so much more acceptable and still improving, but so much more acceptable to just learn online. Secondly, it's become so much more acceptable to learn online without needing to go to a traditional university. Now you can have peer groups teach each other. You've got the Udemys of the world. You've got YouTube. You've got LinkedIn doing courses now. And so that culture is changing. I think that's a huge positive because now we've got an environment where if I'm 60 years old, I don't have to learn from a 25-year-old who doesn't have my experience, the challenges I experience. I can learn from another 60-year-old who sort of faced similar circumstances, has had to learn new skills later in life to, keep their careers going, to manage, paying for their kids' education or whatever else that might be. And I think that's the positive coming out of the pandemic.
I'd like to pick up on the stigma piece because I think that it's a really, really important thing. From my perspective, defining career is helping people think through, what kind of career they want to have. I always say, what's your passion? What do you really love to do? Not the skill stuff, not the stuff that you put down on a piece of paper, but what do you love to do? And the example you gave, Dave, the guy loves to be in his boat, taking people out in his boat. I had this great conversation this week. I'm at the cottage, and one of the programs that got delayed last year because of COVID was the septic inspections. It's a Ontario thing where we're inspecting all of the septic systems to make sure that we're not getting phosphorus and other things into the lakes. So I have this young guy come who introduces himself. Really, really nice young guy. So I'm talking to him. He's an engineering tech student. He's got one more year to go. He told me he had the best summer job. This is the greatest experience of his life. He's learning all sorts of things. And he actually was thinking about going on and actually doing a degree, but he loves doing what he's doing and he's going to follow his passion. He's going to keep working. The guy's looking into people's septic systems, for heaven's sakes. So, okay. The stigma isn't that we all have to go to, a top university and come out with a degree in something that our parents thought was really important. The point is we need to follow our passion. We need to do what makes us happy. I
want to pick up on that because when as a career development professional, one of the things that we know from our sector is that when people hear that it's about following your passion, there's usually a reaction about privilege. That, there's a certain category of people that have an ability to follow their passion, but that's not something that's available and accessible to everybody. And I think it's really important that we hit that right on the head. We're going to see it in the comments. We're going to see it in feedback anytime that you mention that the way to navigate through your career is to follow your passion. And I just want to build on what Sarah was just saying to say, passion is certainly a part of it. If you don't care about the work that you're doing in any way, then you end up in a situation where you feel like you're in a dead-end job. And there's all kinds of social health, there's all kinds of implications of spending decades in a dead-end job. And we know we can think about people that are in those circumstances. So passion is certainly a component of it. But the job also that you get needs to be able to meet your needs, your practical needs. It can't just be all about what you love. It needs to use the talents and skills that you have. And we can come back to how you build those skills in a second. And there needs to be a market for it. So otherwise you're pursuing a hobby. And knowing the difference between pursuing a hobby and pursuing a career is a really important discussion as people are thinking about what skills should I be acquiring so that I can follow my passion. I can have my basic needs met. And I can be using the talents and skills that I'm investing in. If I'm going to go to school, whether that's online, at a college, with a micro-credential, at a university, that's an investment of time and money. How do I make sure that I'm getting a return on investment on that time and money, even if it's in an area that I really, really love? And that leads me to something that Ujwal was just mentioning about some of the ways that we perceive learning over the course of our entire life. There's a myth or a perception that as we age, the return on investment for additional learning and training declines. It's actually, I write about it in the Talent Revolution in section 2. It's one of the 5 myths that we debunk. So people stop signing up for training of their own volition, and employers stop offering training once you hit a certain age because it's seen like, well, there's only so many dollars that we have for training. So why would we train this person who's 20 years into their career when we can train this person who's only 3 years into their career? That's a better return on investment. The truth of the matter is we're working and living really, really long these days. Our mental model of when we are actually out of time to continue learning and working is way out of date. And the opportunity to learn something new in your 50s sets you up for another 20 years of productivity. People are living and working and contributing to their communities well into their 70s today. And so that 20-year period of time, that's a good return on investment. And I think we need to challenge some of the underlying assumptions about who can learn and what model do they learn in and where is their stigma. All of this is based on outdated career thinking. And I just like to throw some of these little nuggets in and challenge how we all think about work and career.
Well, what we all have in common here, and we all have different backgrounds and you all have different disciplines, but what you all have in common is that you're entrepreneurs, that you have stepped out on your own and planted your own flag. You've all got established and successful careers in your own business. And Dave Hardy, it's one of those things that I keep coming back to. We started the whole conversation around teachers. When do we add entrepreneurial skill to the curriculum?
Actually, that's a particularly important question for Canada. Again, back to my maritime background, my grandfather used to talk about the difference between a United States lobster pot on the stove and a Canadian lobster pot. In the United States lobster pot, the lobsters will get together, they'll use their ingenuity, their creativity to figure out a way to get out of the lobster pot, and they'll pull the people up behind them. In the Canadian lobster pot, we have the first lobster figures out how to get out of the lobster pot, and the other lobsters pull them back in and say, "Where do you think you're going?" And that's, to me, that's the Canadian-U.S. dilemma here. We just don't teach entrepreneurship enough. I'm a member of a service group, Rotary, and we take some of the brightest kids out for a full weekend, kind of sabbatical, and introduce them to somebody beyond a teacher. that's what they want to be, because that's the only people they see. So to me, we have an awful long way to go, to do that entrepreneurship.
Ujwal, it's also not just teaching the skill, it's giving somebody the confidence and the courage and saying it's okay sometimes to fail. That's a big part of the lesson.
Yeah, and, culturally, there are so many cues we get around us. And I'll give you one example. When we started our company, we walked into a bank and said, hey, we're going to start this bank account. And by the way, our first 3 customers are in the United States. And, we'd like to get paid. We're probably going to get a check. The bank proceeded to say, yep, we're going to put a 30-day hold on it. And I use this example because, I tried to explain to the teller, of course, I was talking to the wrong person there at that point in time, but I was trying to explain to them, what would you do if I said I'm going to put a 30-day hold on your paycheck? And this is just one example among, I could write a 500-page book on the challenges we experience being entrepreneurs in Canada. Because these are all cultural cues. And I don't just mean infrastructure problems. I mean, these are cultural cues, as in around us, we are surrounded by things in culture that say, you can't do this. You can't do this. Are you sure you want to do this? Are you sure you want to give up a career in advertising, making $180,000 a year? Are you sure? And so that's the challenge. And I think that's a challenge that takes time to overcome. Education itself is not going to solve that. There's the cultural traditions around us have to also change and evolve with it.
We can't just teach innovation.
I love that you mentioned that, Ujwal, because we started this discussion by focusing on skills. And a new innovation report has just come out that shows how does Canada stack up against other countries. And no surprise, we don't stack up all that well. We're not a highly innovative country when we look at entrepreneurship and where we compare to other jurisdictions, as you're all sharing examples. So we know at the highest level that we're not at the leading edge of innovation. And we know some of the ground level problems. And the gap in between tends to be this focus on, well, we need to teach entrepreneurial skills. We need to put in some kind of skills agenda to flip this switch. But as Dave introduced with all of our own experiences, Canadians actually have pretty decent entrepreneurial skills. Ujwal, your barrier wasn't that you didn't have the skills to achieve what you wanted to do in your business. It's that the cues, the cultural aspects of what it means to be innovative within Canada has a weird flavor to it. I know when I gave notice at my Fortune 50 company where I was in the country level management and really destined to continue my entire rest of my career within this global technology company, when I told them I was quitting and doing it to start my own business, I received an enormous amount of concern and counseling, because entrepreneurship is seen as a path that you take when something has gone wrong. And people couldn't get their heads around, there's nothing wrong with how your career is going. So why would you want to do that? That's one of those other examples, Ujwal, of those cues that we get from our peers, right? From our social connections that say, oh, this is a very weird choice that you're making. Where in the States, we would have, I would have started 6 companies by the time I was that age, and I would have just kept on moving. And so we do have this weird relationship with the meaning of entrepreneurship and innovation. And that actually has nothing to do with skills. So analysis on, we need to study skills, we need to do more on this, it's the wrong direction. It won't actually solve the problem.
If we've done nothing else there, I think that what we saw was we broke the egg open here, and we determined that skills in this new environment, we have to really rethink how we look at what skills are and how they affect what we do on a daily basis. When I love to listen to Lisa when she finally said, pursuing a hobby versus pursuing a career informs a different approach to how you are going to develop your skills, whether it's an entrepreneurial skill, whether it's a communication skill that you might not have otherwise had before, that you have discovered. And now there's an opportunity there to make life, all the more productive, all the more passionate, all the more exciting in the workplace.
What really stood out for me too is that I think what has happened, or what the pandemic highlighted, is our obsession with skills, right? That we're obsessed with this old way of thinking that skills will close the gap. But what really, I think, came out in that conversation for me is that this is a cultural call to action, is that we need to start fostering an environment politically, socially, culturally that allows for innovation, and that the innovation is what will lead the skills. So, I found it really interesting about the conversation of online learning and how it used to have a bit of a bad rap, but now, people in their 50s, 60s are using it as a way to innovate and build new skills. I think it's fascinating when we look at what our next steps need to be in order to create a better next normal.
Well, the whole issue around innovation, it came up in the conversation, but it also came up recently in a worldwide survey done about innovation and how Canadian cities have fallen right off the cliff in terms of innovation. Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, always used to be right up there in terms of considered innovative cities. For whatever reason, during the pandemic, they've just plummeted. Why is that? It's not just a one-off, as to say one city, right across the board. And Lisa, I think, what pointed out in this last episode, generally speaking, we are not good at innovation in Canada. Maybe that's a skill we need to develop.
Yeah, and that's good teaser there, because that's exactly what we're going to get into in the next episode. We're going to talk about innovation and technology and the steps we can take to foster that environment as we move forward. The Next Normal is sponsored by Challenge Factory, shaping the future of work.
By Decision Partners. Our world is a better place when we make better decisions.
By Motive Base, decoding implicit meaning behind what people talk about.
And by Hardy Stevenson and Associates, planning the cities of the future.
Comments, questions, or ideas for our hosts? Feel free to drop us an email at hello@storystudionetwork.com.
This series is produced for the Story Studio Network by Eye Contact Productions.
This
is SSN.